The wind had a voice that night, a deep and hollow moan that scraped against the corners of the world and promised to scour it clean. In the small, huddled town of Providence, shutters rattled like the bones of a dying man, and the cold was a physical presence, a predator that slipped through every crack in every wall. Sheriff Brody pulled his collar tighter, the frozen wool scratching his chin. His breath plumed white in the lantern light, a fleeting ghost in the swirling chaos of the blizzard. Every home he passed was a study in desperation. Weak, flickering lights shone from behind iced-over window panes, and the smoke that trickled from their chimneys was thin and pale, a sign of dwindling fuel and dying fires. He had just come from the Gable house, where the mayor's wife, a woman known for her unshakable composure, was weeping as her husband tried to burn a dining chair to keep their children from freezing. They were all running out. The woodpiles, stacked high and proud in the autumn, were now frozen tombs buried under 10 feet of snow. The green wood they had was worse than useless, spitting and hissing and giving no heat. But one chimney, one lone pillar against the screaming white, told a different story. At the edge of town, in the small cabin belonging to the young widow Annalise, the smoke rose thick and dark and steady. It did not falter. It did not thin. It was a column of defiance, a testament to a fire that burned hot and true. It made no sense. She was a widow with only her frail, elderly mother for help. How could she, of all people, be so prepared? The town had pitied her, whispered about her strange, mad project all through the summer and autumn. Now, their pity had frozen into a desperate, gnawing envy. The steady plume of smoke was an accusation. It was a mystery. It was, perhaps, their only hope. But this story does not begin with the freezing wind or the desperate sheriff. It begins under the gentle sun of a late spring morning, with the scent of pine and damp earth hanging in the air. Annalise stood beside her mother, Marin, staring at the pathetic stack of firewood beside their cabin. It was a meager collection of damp, half-rotted logs left over from the previous winter, a winter that had taken her husband and left her with a silence that filled every room. She was 25, but felt as ancient as the mountains that loomed over the valley. Marin, whose face was a beautiful map of 70 hard-won years, placed a thin, wrinkled hand on her daughter's arm. "It is not enough," Marin said, her voice quiet but clear, like the trickling of a deep spring. "The almanac predicts a long cold. The old signs agree. The woolly worms have thick coats, and the squirrels are hoarding pine cones with a fever I have not seen in decades." Annalise sighed, the weight of the coming seasons pressing down on her. "We will cut what we can, mother." "It is all we can do." Marin shook her head slowly. "Cutting is only half the battle, child. The wood must be dry. Bone dry. Green wood is a cold comfort. My father, your grandfather, he knew the secret to it. He never feared a blizzard." Annalise had heard the stories before, tales of her grandfather, a man who seemed more legend than memory. "The breathing cellar," she murmured, recalling the phrase from childhood. "He called it that," Marin affirmed, a distant light in her eyes. "Not a root cellar for potatoes and beets, but a long, underground tunnel. Lined with timber, with shelves for the logs and clever little vents to the surface that let the damp air escape. The earth itself draws the moisture out, seasoning the wood faster and better than any summer sun, and it keeps the snows from ever touching it. He could have a roaring fire when all his neighbors were burning their furniture." Annalise looked at the hard-packed earth beside their cabin, at the thick roots of the pines that wove through the soil like buried veins of iron. The idea was immense, impossible. It was the work of a team of strong men, not a young woman and her aging mother. "Mother, that is a folk tale. To dig such a thing, it would take us years." Marin's grip on her arm tightened, her fingers surprisingly strong. "Faith is not a folk tale, Annalise. It is a tool, like a shovel or an axe. Your grandfather built his with his own 2 hands. He said the world gives you what you need to survive, but it rarely makes it easy to reach. He dug. So we will dig." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of the wind in the pines. Annalise looked at her own hands, calloused from farm work but not shaped for such a monumental task. She saw the doubt in her own heart, a reflection of the doubt she knew the entire town would soon cast upon her. But then she looked at her mother's face, at the unwavering certainty in her eyes, and she remembered the cold of the last winter, the feeling of helplessness as the woodpile dwindled. She thought of the steady, quiet strength that had carried her mother through a lifetime of hardships. Perhaps madness was simply a name that fear gave to courage. "Show me where to begin," Annalise said, her voice barely a whisper, and in that moment, the first shovelful of earth was turned. The work began not with a grand effort, but with a simple, brutal rhythm. Pickaxe, shovel, bucket. Pickaxe, shovel, bucket. The ground fought back with a stubbornness that seemed personal. It was a dense mixture of clay and stone, laced with a web of ancient tree roots that had to be severed one by one with a hand axe. Annalise's muscles, accustomed to the labor of mending fences and tending a garden, screamed in protest. Her shoulders burned, her back ached with a fire that never fully subsided, and her hands were soon a raw landscape of blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into thick, clumsy callus. Each morning, she would rise before the sun, her body stiff and sore, and force herself out into the cool air. Marin would be waiting for them, a bucket of cool well water in one hand and a whetstone in the other. While Annalise swung the heavy pickaxe, Marin would sit on a nearby stump, her old hands patiently sharpening the blades of the shovel and the axe, her presence a silent, unwavering vigil. She could not do the heavy lifting, but her contribution was no less vital. She was the keeper of the vision, the anchor of their shared purpose. "Do not fight the stone," she would say, her voice carrying over the rhythmic thud of the pickaxe. "Persuade it. Each blow is a conversation. The earth will yield, but it will not be bullied." The days bled into one another, a blur of sweat, dirt, and exhaustion. The hole grew slowly, agonizingly. First it was a pit, then a trench. Neighbors would pass on their way to town, slowing their wagons to stare. They saw a young widow, her face smudged with dirt and her dress hemmed with mud, digging a pointless hole while her elderly mother watched. They saw madness. The whispers started as a trickle and soon became a flood, eroding the town's sympathy for the young widow and replacing it with a mixture of pity and scorn. Mr. Thorne, the owner of the town's lumber mill and a man who considered himself the final authority on all things wood, was the first to voice his expert opinion directly. He stopped his wagon one sweltering afternoon, leaning his thick forearms on the side rail as he looked down into the trench where Annalise was working. "What in creation are you doing, girl?" he boomed, his voice thick with condescending amusement. Annalise paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty hand. "I'm digging a cellar to dry our firewood." Thorne let out a short, barking laugh. "A cellar? You'll rot it, is what you'll do. Wood needs air, sunlight. You stack it high, leave a space for the wind to pass through. Everyone knows that. Burying it is a fool's errand. The damp will turn it to mush." He shook his head, a grim smile on his face. "You listen to me. I've been in the timber business for 30 years. This is madness." He drove off without waiting for a reply, the phrase "fool's errand" hanging in the hot, still air. Next came Mrs. Gable, the mayor's wife, who arrived under the pretense of delivering a small loaf of bread. She clucked her tongue, her eyes full of practiced pity. "Oh, Annalise, you poor dear," she began, her voice a syrupy whisper. "Grief does strange things to the mind. You must not exhaust yourself with this. You should be in town, at the sewing circle. There are good, unattached men in Providence. You are too young to resign yourself to a life of digging in the dirt." Her words were meant to sound like kindness, but they were stones wrapped in velvet, each one a judgment on Annalise's choices, her sanity, her refusal to follow the expected path of a grieving widow. Even Sheriff Brody, a man Annalise had always considered fair, paid a visit. He removed his hat, his face etched with genuine but misplaced concern. He said, his tone gentle, "I don't mean to interfere. But folks are worried. A hole this deep, it's not safe. What if it collapses on you? I have to think of your welfare." "It will be reinforced," Annalise stated, her voice flat. "It is an old design." The sheriff sighed, placing his hat back on his head. "Old ways aren't always the best ways, Annalise. I can't force you to stop, but I'm asking you to reconsider." The message was clear. The practical expert, the community matriarch, the well-intentioned authority, they had all passed their judgment. She was alone, armed with nothing but a shovel, an old woman's memory, and a resolve that hardened with every skeptical glance and whispered doubt. The sun of high summer became a merciless tyrant, beating down on the exposed earth and on Annelise's bent back. The trench was now deep enough that she had to use a rickety ladder to climb in and out, hauling up buckets of dirt and rock with a rope and pulley system she had devised. The isolation was complete. Wagons no longer slowed, they hurried past, the occupants averting their eyes as if her toil were a contagious disease. She worked in a bubble of silence, the only sounds the scrape of her shovel and the steady, rhythmic breathing of her own exertion. One afternoon, the earth betrayed her. She was working at the far end of the trench, beginning to carve out the horizontal tunnel, when a low groan echoed from the wall above. She looked up just as a section of the clay bank, weakened by a hidden pocket of moisture, gave way. It was not a catastrophic collapse, but several 100 pounds of dirt and stone cascaded down, burying her tools and trapping her leg up to the knee. For a heart-stopping moment, there was only the ringing in her ears and the suffocating smell of damp earth. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She was alone. No one would come. No one would even know where to look. The weight on her leg was immense, a crushing pressure that sent waves of pain up her thigh. But then, through the haze of fear, she heard her mother's voice from the edge of the pit. "Anneliese! Are you well?" Marian's voice was strained, but it was not panicked. It was a lifeline. "I am trapped," Anneliese called back, her own voice trembling. "My leg." There was a pause, and then Marian's calm instructions floated down. "Do not struggle. You will only make it tighter. Breathe. Be like the water, not the stone. Find the path of least resistance." Anneliese closed her eyes, forcing air into her tight chest. She did as her mother said, slowly, carefully wiggling her trapped foot, feeling for any give in the heavy soil. It took nearly an hour of painstaking, agonizing work, digging with her bare hands, but she finally freed herself. She emerged from the trench limping, covered in dirt, her leg a canvas of deep bruises. That night, as Marian wrapped her swollen ankle, despair settled over Anneliese like a shroud. "They are right," she whispered into the quiet of the cabin. "Mr. Thorne, Mrs. Gable, all of them. This is madness. It almost killed me." Marian finished tying the bandage and looked her daughter in the eye. "The earth tested you," she said softly. "It asked if you were worthy of its secrets. It asked if you had the patience to listen. Tomorrow, you will go back, and you will build supports before you dig another inch. You will show it you have learned." Anneliese looked at her mother, at the unyielding strength in that frail frame, and her own resolve, which had crumbled into dust, began to reform, harder and more resilient than before. The near disaster marked a turning point. The work was no longer just about digging, it became about building, about creating a space that was not just hollow, but strong. Anneliese spent the next week felling slender pine and aspen trees from the woods behind their cabin. She and Marian worked together, using a two-person crosscut saw, its rhythmic shush-shush-shush a new song for their days. Anneliese would then hew the logs into sturdy posts and beams with a broad axe, the clean scent of fresh cut wood a welcome change from the stale smell of clay. Following Marian's detailed recollections of her father's design, she began to construct a wooden skeleton inside the tunnel. She set thick posts every 4 feet, sinking them into the tunnel floor. Across the top, she laid heavy beams, wedging them tightly against the earthen ceiling. Between the posts, she painstakingly fitted thick planks, creating solid walls that would hold back the immense pressure of the earth. It was slow, precise work, a world away from the brute force of the initial excavation. Each joint had to be perfect, each beam level. She learned the language of wood, its grains, its knots, its strengths. While she worked, Marian tackled the most crucial and ingenious part of the design, the ventilation. Her grandfather had understood that the key to drying the wood was not just removing moisture, but giving it somewhere to go. Following her instructions, Anneliese dug 2 small, narrow shafts, no wider than a man's arm, from the far end of the tunnel straight up to the surface. The shafts emerged 30 yards away from the main entrance, hidden among a natural outcropping of rocks. Marian then carefully lined the openings with stones, creating small, discreet chimneys that looked like little more than natural fissures in the landscape. The warm, damp air will rise and seek the cold, she explained, her hands deftly placing the stones. It will be drawn out through these vents, and fresh, dry air will be pulled in from the cabin entrance. The tunnel will breathe, Annalise. It will be alive. As the structure took shape, it transformed from a dangerous hole into a sanctuary of wood and earth, a long, vaulted chamber that felt safe and solid. It was a testament not to madness, but to a forgotten engineering, a wisdom that worked in harmony with the natural world instead of fighting against it. With the first chill of autumn painting the aspen leaves gold and crimson, a new urgency set in. The tunnel was built, but it was empty. Now came the harvest. This phase of the labor was a relentless, punishing marathon that lasted from dawn until dusk, 7 days a week. Annalise and Marin could not fell the massive pines that the lumber mill harvested. Instead, they focused on the deadfall, trees already felled by wind or age, and the stands of smaller, more manageable lodgepole pines and aspens that grew thick on the slopes behind their property. The forest echoed with the sharp crack of Annalise's axe. She would fell a tree, then limb it with swift, efficient blows, her movements now economical and powerful after months of labor. Marin, unable to swing the axe, would gather the smaller branches and tie them into bundles for kindling. The hardest part was moving the logs. Their only equipment was a simple wooden cart Annalise had built herself. Its wheels were solid slices of a large log, and they wobbled and groaned under the slightest weight. Loading the heavy green logs onto the cart was a struggle of levers and brute strength. Annalise would use a thick branch as a pry bar, slowly, inch by inch, rolling a log up a small ramp of packed earth and onto the cart's flatbed. Then came the hauling. She would lean into the rough-hewn handle, her boots slipping in the pine needles and mud, her muscles straining as she dragged the protesting cart from the woods to the mouth of the tunnel. It was a journey of only a few hundred yards, but each trip felt like a mile. She made dozens of these trips a day, her body a machine fueled by desperation and the ever-present knowledge that winter was coming. The town watched this new phase of her follies with renewed bewilderment. They saw her emerge from the woods, caked in mud and sawdust, dragging a load of wood not to a neat stack beside her cabin, but to the gaping hole in the ground. They saw her disappear into the earth with her harvest, like a creature of folklore storing treasures in its lair. The work was isolating, but inside the tunnel, a different world existed. The air was cool and smelled of earth and fresh pine. It was their world, built with their own hands, and within its timbered walls, the whispers of the town could not reach them. The final act of preparation was a ritual of patience and precision. As Annalise hauled the last possible load of wood from the forest, the first snowflakes of the season began to drift down from a grey, heavy sky. They were small and delicate, a gentle warning of the fury to come. Inside the tunnel, which now stretched a full 50 feet from the small, timber-lined entrance in their cellar to its terminus deep in the hillside, the real work of Marin's memory began. It was not enough to simply throw the wood inside. The wood must breathe, Marin repeated, her voice echoing slightly in the long, narrow space. Every log needs its own air, its own space to release its dampness. Under her mother's careful direction, Annalise began to stack the logs on the sturdy shelves that lined the walls. She left a gap of an inch between each log, and a larger space between the stacks and the earthen walls, creating channels for the air to circulate. It was like completing a massive, intricate puzzle. She stacked the larger logs on the bottom shelves and the smaller ones on top. The kindling bundles Marin had made were tucked into their own designated sections. It took days to fill the tunnel, to transform the empty wooden skeleton into a library of fuel, each log a promise of warmth and life. When the last log was in place, they stood back and admired their work. The tunnel was a marvel of stored energy, a fortress against the coming cold. Lit by the soft glow of a single lantern, it felt like a sacred place. They sealed the main, external entrance with heavy planks and packed earth, leaving it invisible from the outside. The only way in or out was now through a small, sturdy door they had built in the wall of their cabin's tiny root cellar. With the tunnel filled and sealed, a profound quiet settled over their homestead. The work was done. All that was left was to wait. Outside, the snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing the town of Providence, covering the neat, exposed woodpiles of their neighbors, and hiding all evidence of the widow's folly beneath a pristine sheet of white. The blizzard did not arrive, it descended. It fell upon Providence like a judgment, a great white beast of wind and ice that swallowed the sky and erased the world. For 3 days it raged, and then for 3 more, the wind never ceasing its relentless assault. The temperature plummeted to a level no one could remember, a cold so deep it felt as if the sun had been extinguished forever. Inside their small cabin, Anneliese and Marin lived in a cocoon of warmth. A fire roared in their stone hearth, a fire fed by the perfectly seasoned wood from the tunnel. Each trip to the cellar was a journey of revelation. Anneliese would open the small door and be met not with a damp chill, but with a wave of cool, dry air that smelled faintly of pine. The logs were light in her arms, their bark peeling away easily, their insides pale and dry. When placed on the fire, they caught immediately, burning with a clean, intense heat that sent waves of life through the small cabin. Outside, the town was dying. The neatly stacked woodpiles were useless, buried under impassable drifts and frozen solid. The wood that people could retrieve was green or damp, producing more smoke than heat. Families huddled together under blankets in a single room, their breath misting in the air, the fear of freezing a palpable entity in the house with them. It was on the 7th night of the storm that the desperate, frantic pounding came at their door. Anneliese opened it to find Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of wind-burned skin and frozen whiskers. He looked past her, his eyes wide, drawn to the impossible sight of the roaring fire. He looked at her, no longer with pity or concern, but with a desperate, bewildered awe. "How," he stammered, the words snatched away by the wind. "Your fire, everyone else is freezing. We're burning furniture. Thorne's mill is out of dry lumber. How are you doing this?" Anneliese looked at the sheriff, at the man who had warned her against her own salvation, and felt no triumph, only a deep, somber weariness. "We prepared," she said simply. "Please, Anneliese," he begged, his authority stripped away, leaving only a man responsible for the lives of his people. "Whatever you have, we need it. The Gable children are sick. Old man Hemlock, we think he may have already frozen. We need fuel." Anneliese held his gaze, the howling wind filling the silence between them. She thought of the whispers, the mockery, the isolation. Then she thought of the Gable children, their faces blue with cold. Her victory would be meaningless if it was hers alone. "I will share," she said, her voice clear and steady over the storm. "On one condition. You will help me carry it." The sheriff, expecting to be turned away or to have to plead further, could only nod, his throat thick with emotion. Anneliese led him not to a woodshed, but down the steep steps into her small root cellar. She lifted the lantern, and its light fell upon the small, sturdy wooden door set into the earthen wall. Brody stared, confused. He had never seen a door there before. Anneliese lifted the heavy iron latch and pulled it open. A gust of cool, dry air, smelling of aged pine and deep earth, flowed out. She stepped through, holding the lantern high, and the sheriff followed, his boots hesitant on the hard-packed floor. His gasp echoed in the long, vaulted chamber. The lantern light revealed a scene of impossible abundance. On both sides of the tunnel, stretching far back into the darkness, were shelves stacked high with perfectly cut, perfectly dry firewood. It was a dragon's hoard of warmth, a vein of pure life hidden in the frozen earth. He reached out a trembling, gloved hand and touched a log. It was dry to the touch, almost warm. He looked at the massive timber supports, the carefully planked walls, the sheer scale of the construction, and he finally understood. This was not madness. This was wisdom. This was foresight beyond anything he could have imagined. "My God," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. Soon, he returned with Mr. Thorne and a half-dozen other able-bodied men from the town. Thorne's face was a study in disbelief and profound humility as he stepped into the tunnel. He ran his hand over the dry, seasoned wood, the very wood he had proclaimed would rot into mush. He looked at the ingenious construction, the simple but effective ventilation system he could now feel as a slight draft, and he said nothing. His silence was the most profound apology he could have offered. That night, a procession of men carried armloads of the life-saving wood from Anneliese's tunnel, distributing it to the coldest homes first. The thin, pale smoke rising from the town's chimneys was slowly replaced by thick, dark plumes, mirroring the one that had been their beacon of hope. Annalise did not gloat. She did not demand apologies. She simply stood at the cellar door, directing the men, ensuring they took what was needed. Mrs. Gable, when a load was brought to her door, refused to meet the eyes of the man delivering it, her face burning with a shame that had nothing to do with the returning warmth of her house. The blizzard eventually broke, but the town of Providence was forever changed. The widow's folly was now spoken of with reverence. Renamed the Providence Vein, the tunnel became a communal resource, expanded over the years, its design copied by others. Annalise was no longer the strange, grieving widow, but a quiet pillar of her community, a woman whose wisdom was now sought instead of scorned. Her story became a legend, a piece of folklore told around warm fires on cold winter nights, a reminder that the most profound strength is often found not in loud declarations, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of the work. And what of the forgotten wisdom, the knowledge passed down from an old woman's memory? How often do we dismiss the old ways as foolish, only to find, in our moment of greatest need, that they hold the very key to our survival?